Extraordinary scenes, Gordon. Huw Edwards, a man that we are used to being front and centre of major news events in this country as a News at 10 anchor, in Ray-Bans, at Westminster Magistrates Court, pleading guilty to making indecent images of children, including one relating to a child that appeared to be as young as 7 years old.
Yeah, incredible turn of events and an awful lot of questions, I think, for the BBC. He's not the first paedophile that the BBC has turned out to have employed. Questions for them to answer about why they gave him a £40,000 pay rise while he was suspended, and also about whether they protected him in any way.
And Southport. We haven't discussed that tragedy on the Daily Tea, but it's taken on a new dimension in light of rioting overnight. Are politicians like Nigel Farage actually stoking the tensions there?
And the impact of social media on that and live police investigations.
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Camilla Tominey.
And me, Gordon Rayner. So let's talk about Huw Edwards. We need to just remind ourselves of how we got to this point. Huw Edwards, household name, obviously, BBC News at 10 presenter. He's the voice of the nation when it comes to things like royal events. He was investigated by the BBC over a relationship with a 17-year-old last year. He was suspended last summer. The police looked at it and at that point said there was no evidence of criminality in that particular case. But in November, he was arrested on what we now know were separate allegations. He left the BBC in April, and then we found out on Monday that he'd been charged. And then this morning, he appeared in Westminster Magistrates Court, where our reporter, Max Stevens, who's with us now, was among those who saw what went on. Max, can you describe for us what the scene was in court?
There was a lot of expectation from journalists about what we would hear. The courtroom was packed, both in the public gallery and the press bench. There was around half a dozen police officers were with him outside the courtroom, and they had to sort of push themselves through the scrum of journalists and a few anti-BBC protesters who had assembled outside. But inside the courtroom, it was him and his legal counsel.
So he goes into the dock. Then what happened?
He gave a slight smile to one of his legal counsel before he sat down. He appeared very sort of composed and professional. I mean, the charges were read out to him. Edwards was accused of possessing 41 indecent images of children, 7 of which were in category A, which is the worst and the most serious. 12 were in category B and 22 were category C.
And I think we should probably just explain to people, category A images involve, and I'm sorry to have to read this, but they involve penetrative sexual activity with an animal, or sadism. We don't know exactly which of those we're talking about, but that's what category A means.
Just to break it down, because it's quite hard to understand exactly what's happened here, making an indecent image doesn't mean, Gordon, that you've actually sort of staged something and filmed it yourself. You can make an indecent image if you receive an indecent image, open it, and indeed download it on WhatsApp or another technological platform.
Yeah.
What appears to have happened here is he has been in a quite long-standing dialogue with a man who is described in court as another paedophile.
Yeah.
This guy is sending him images. There's a conversation that's taking place about the age of the victims appearing in the images.
Yeah.
But at no point does Edwards alert the police to the images he's receiving.
No, I think that's an important point, isn't it? That okay, he was being sent these images. I think the court was told that he at some point told the man, don't send me anything underage. But when he was being sent images, which were clearly of children, as described in court, who looked between 7 and 9, he didn't then contact the police or alert anybody to the fact that he was being sent these images.
Max, you see him in the dock there. He's obviously such a recognisable figure. Until recently, we're used to this man anchoring major news events, literally being the presenter of the News at 10 the day Queen Elizabeth II dies. And yet in this capacity, you're saying he's holding himself together in that kind of TV professional gaze?
He looked very composed throughout the whole 26-minute-long hearing. He sat with his legs crossed. He didn't look towards the public gallery or the press bench. He kept his gaze sort of fixed towards Chief Magistrate Paul Goldspring. When he pleaded guilty to the offences, he said it in a loud, clear voice. His voice didn't waver. It didn't break.
What was the court told by his defence team?
So his defence lawyers stressed that he pleaded guilty to possessing the images of children. And he stresses for the benefit of the public that that's not the same as making or filming, any of the acts shown in these images and videos. His lawyer said that police had searched all of his electronic devices and they hadn't found anything indecent, which obviously raises, the question of what sparked this police investigation. He said that none of this material was shared or distributed by Edwards at all, and that Edwards hadn't gone looking for any other sort of child pornography elsewhere. He did mention that, Edwards, at the time of the offending, had been suffering from mental health difficulties, but there was no sort of further context provided as to why between December 2020 and August 2021 he took the actions that he did.
Max, we know you've got copy to write for tomorrow's paper, so thank you so much for joining us in the Daily Teach studio.
Thank you for having me.
Gordon, on sentencing, Edwards has been defended on the basis of his exemplary character, no previous convictions. He has pled guilty. There's now talk of him maybe having a suspended sentence imposed on him. There's a sentencing hearing on the 16th of September, or it might even be a community sentence of 3 months because, and this is awful to say, isn't it? But in this case, it's only, I put that in inverted commas, because one image is one image too many, 41, and in this case, he didn't share them.
So in court, it was said that the sentencing guidelines for an offence of this type and for these particular set of offences would be a maximum of 3 years imprisonment, but that it would be more likely that he would receive a suspended sentence. It does seem as though the maximum sentence for these offences is quite low, and it's actually quite rare for people to actually be sent to prison for this. It's normally a suspended sentence.
Which is kind of horrifying. Look, let's not find this guy guilty of more than he's pleaded guilty to. But of course, as parents, we look at this. You're in a position of such huge influence and authority. You're living this gilded life. You're, Britain's most well-known journalist, and this happens. It's easy to forget, Gordon, that the public reaction once he was named. I mean, I remember discussing it with my father in a car travelling somewhere, and he just couldn't believe it. He literally turned around to me and said, "You are bloody joking."
Yeah.
Outrage, really, because of his position of great influence and privilege, I guess.
Yeah.
The other thing is the questions this raises for the BBC. I cannot believe that in the last few days we were reporting a story about him having been given a 40 grand pay rise. So he was on between £435,000 and £439,999. And then we found out quite recently in the annual report that he was given an increase of £40,000, taking him up to £475,000 a year, despite the BBC knowing he was under police investigation. I admit, I appreciate they didn't know what for. And indeed, as the law stands, you have to suspend an employee on full pay. I get that. But
you don't have to give them a pay rise.
What shouldn't somebody at the BBC have said, is it appropriate right now to give him a pay rise when there is this cloud of suspicion hanging over him? This is just another episode that is going to cast the BBC in a terrible light. It's not the first time that allegations have come to light relating to a BBC employee.
No, I think what's different about this is that this is someone who was employed at the time this all came to light. He's a huge part of the BBC, or was. Previous cases like Jimmy Savile, like Stuart Hall, like Rolf Harris were historic. But in this case, we're talking about someone who was front and centre of the BBC as an organisation when this was going on. I think there are questions to ask, not just about money, but about who knew what was going on, because we know that with the incident involving the 17-year-old, which ultimately led to him being suspended and then leaving the BBC in April, there are suggestions that the BBC knew about that before he was suspended.
And then let's not forget, so when this all came to light and there was a suggestion in the Sun newspaper that a BBC presenter had been, in inverted commas, grooming a 17-year-old boy, And this is social media to blame. We're going to discuss this in a moment relating to Southport, but just on this for now, you then get all of this online speculation about who it might be. You'll remember it, Gordon. I remember it. Everyone always messaged journalists, who is it, expecting us to tell them. And you then had this awful situation for other BBC presenters who then have this spotlight of suspicion placed on them.
Yeah.
So we had people like Nikki Campbell, Ryland Clark, Gary Lineker, and Jeremy Vine all having to say, it's not me, Gov.
Yeah, because the BBC immediately decided that they wanted to draw a veil of secrecy around this. I'm not quite sure why they thought that that was going to work, because it wasn't as though people weren't going to work out eventually who this was, especially when he was taken off air. It comes down to that question of how long had they known about this? And then when they did suspend him, why on earth did they think it was the right thing to do to not identify who this high-profile presenter was, thus allowing this speculation about other people to drag on?
Also, it was his wife in the end, who he is now, we understand, separated from, who sort of named him and then said that he was having mental health problems and that he'd been admitted to the Priory to be treated.
Not the BBC.
Not the BBC, which is problematic. So the BBC has questions to answer. Who else has questions to answer here, Gordon?
Well, I think the police and the Crown Prosecution Service have questions to answer, because we only found out 2 days ago that he'd been charged, even though he was charged last month. Now, you and I both know that when a high-profile case like this happens, it's normal for the CPS or the police to announce that the person has been charged, to announce when the court date is. Instead, it seems that the only reason that anybody found out this was happening was because there was a sharp-eyed court reporter, we think, who saw this appearing on the list for Wednesday, and the police then confirmed that that was indeed the case, that he was going to be in court. So why did they decide not to notify anybody that this high-profile person had been charged with serious offences and was going to appear in court?
It's an interesting case, this, of actual journalism versus sort of online activism. And that's important because we're going to discuss it in a minute relating to Southport. But when The Sun originally reported on the whole grooming scandal, there was criticism, wasn't there, particularly by some people on the left saying, oh, you know, nothing to see here, leave the man alone, he's got mental health problems.
And he's done nothing wrong.
He's done nothing wrong, which may be true regarding the mental health problems. We do have sympathy with people that are suffering in life. However, we then move it forward and we get to this and indecent images of children. And it reminds us, Gordon, of the importance of whoever the wily court reporter was who spotted his name on a list and made sure that we have open justice in this case. And I just think it's significant to make that point. We're not just blowing our trumpets as journos, but the point here is journalistic accountability really matters.
Yeah, justice has to be done, but it also has to be seen to be done. And you can't do that if someone like Huw Edwards turns up in court, pleads guilty, is then possibly even sentenced without anybody knowing about it, which is what would have happened if it hadn't been for somebody who had been bright enough and alert enough to see it on the court list.
Coming up next, as I say, we're going to be discussing the tragedy in Southport, but also the way in which social media has made the job of the police and those supporting the victims and their families even more difficult. Welcome back. Gordon, I'm looking at the front page of the Daily Telegraph, and it's got these pictures of these beautiful girls. I mean, it makes me well up. I'm struggling to talk about this story. I was in tears about it last night, listening to an eyewitness talk through what he observed in Southport on Monday afternoon. Got these beautiful kids, BB King, 6, Elsie Stancombe, 7, Alice Aguiar, 9, who have been killed. We don't do cases like this necessarily on the Daily Tea because what can you say in the face of a tragedy like this beyond sympathising as a parent? I mean, it's absolutely horrific. We've got 5 other children still in critical care in hospital. We've got 2 adults. We've got emergency services still deeply traumatised, a community in mourning. Yeah, it's just it's sort of beyond imagination and description, frankly. And then we have the scenes that unfolded last night on top of it all.
Yeah, So there was a vigil being held on Tuesday night for the victims. That was followed by violence. A van was set on fire. Then there was a gang of around 200 thugs who turned up at a mosque and confronted the police. These are the police who responded to the incident in the first place. They were throwing bricks and rocks at them. The authorities said that this was being fueled by misinformation being put online about the 17-year-old suspect who is in police custody. What we know about him is that he was born in Cardiff to Rwandan parents. He was living in a place called Banks, which is about 6 miles from Southport. But a false rumour started circulating on social media that he was an asylum seeker who arrived illegally by boat. And today we've had our Telegraph colleagues Martin Evans and Charles Hymas reporting that Russian state-controlled media was among those who were spreading false claims, including that he was a suspect on an MI6 watch list.
We can understand why emotions are running high. If this had happened in your community, you would be feeling the same. Those emotions did come to the fore when Prime Minister Keir Starmer visited yesterday.
How many more children have died in our streets, Prime Minister? How many more children? How many more children, Prime Minister? Are we going to do something? Time to change, Starmer. Come on, it's needed. How many more children? Is it mine next?
I mean, that's hard, isn't it? Because he's tried to do the right thing. He's gone after the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, who gave a very heartfelt and moving statement in the House of Commons yesterday after spending some time up in Southport.
I do have sympathy for Keir Starmer. I think it's an impossible choice for him to make. If he goes, there's the danger that he will be accused of opportunism. If he doesn't go, there's a danger that he'll be accused of being unfeeling, and people will say, well, where is he? Why has he not shown up at the scene? So I don't think you can possibly get that decision right. You're always going to be criticised either way.
But has one politician mishandled this even more? And I'm talking about Nigel Farage. He records a video and posts it on X.
I have to say there are one or two questions. Was this guy being monitored by the security services? Some reports say he was, others less sure. The police say it's a non-terror incident, just as they said the stabbing of an Army Lieutenant Colonel in uniform on the streets of Kent the other day was a non-terror incident. I just wonder whether the truth is being withheld from us. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it is a fair and legitimate question. What I do know is something is going horribly wrong in our once beautiful country.
I mean, I completely understand the need to ask serious questions about this whole case. We're struggling to understand, any possible motive. How could this have happened? The police response. But what did you think about him repeating, seemingly, some of the speculation that's been made online?
Well, I think the most important thing he said in that clip was, we don't know. And I think it's very dangerous when we don't know to then start speculating. He's more than welcome to come back on this when there are more facts that emerge about what actually did go on here. But we have no idea what the motive for this attack was, and we know very little about the person who committed it. So there has been a lot of criticism of Nigel Farage for his comments. Jess Phillips, the Labour MP, has accused him of being a grifter. She said on X, Nigel Farage could yesterday have had the questions he claims are unanswered, answered if he had bothered to turn up in Parliament and ask them during the statement on the incidents in Southport. He didn't turn up, he grifted instead.
Former Tory MP Tobias Ellwood, whose own brother Jonathan was killed in the 2002 Bali bombing, was even sort of stronger in his condemnation of Farage, who, let's be honest, he's not a big fan of and never has been. He's basically said Farage should take down that video, disgusting how a sitting MP deliberately inflames tensions without any justification.
And then we've had Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, saying speculation and some of the untruths that are being put around social media are not only creating tensions and fear in the community, but it's disrespectful to families that want those answers. It's not helpful for anyone. My plea is to step back. That information will come, but allow the police and the authorities to do their work and keep in mind the victims and the families that are at the heart of this trauma.
I mean, amen to that. I think that's a sensible thing for her to have said. She appeared on ITV's This Morning and said it. This is a problem, though. Social media and how the criminal justice system copes if people start spreading misinformation online that then leads to what we observed in Southport. I mean, can we call it a riot?
Yep.
I mean, bricks are being thrown
It's a riot.
at police officers and a police van has been caught alight. What can we do to stop it? Because the law hasn't been able to catch up, I don't think, with the advent of the internet, social media, and people basically publishing with impunity. This is when we come back to this conversation we've just had about Huw Edwards.
Yep.
You've got legitimate journalism that is subject to regulation and the letter of the law. There's stuff we can publish and stuff we absolutely can't, just as there's stuff we can say on this podcast and things that we can't. And then these keyboard warriors who just say whatever they like at will. I appreciate that some of them have been cracked down on in the past, if they've defamed people, if they've been seen to incite violence. Yes, they do feel the long arm of the law, but isn't there a question here to be asked about the moderation of some of these comments when they're made by the tech giants?
Yeah, look, I feel very strongly about this. I feel very angry about the way that technology companies just seem to throw their hands up in the air and say, well, we can't stop people posting these comments on social media. We do our best to moderate it. We can't employ enough people to moderate every comment. What can we do? Well, they created these platforms. It's their problem. It's not a problem that's unsolvable. It's not a problem that the police and the courts and the online companies should just put in the too difficult pile. There is a way of sorting this out. It may be that it's a very tough way of sorting it out. You know, the ultimate way of stopping people posting on Twitter would be for Twitter to pre-moderate all comments. Now, I know that's pretty much impossible, but it does feel as if there's an awful lot more they could do to stop people from putting these comments online, from inciting rioting, rather than just saying, oh, nothing we can do about it.
Nothing to see here. The Online Safety Act is meant to be dealing with all this, by the way, Gordon.
Yeah, but as you say, it feels like the law just can't keep up with the pace of change, with the sheer volume of information that is put out on social media. We talk a lot about artificial intelligence. Maybe there's an answer there. Maybe they can use AI better to stop these comments at source before they get put online. Because it's all very well having laws that punish people for doing things, but we don't want to see riots that are incited by misinformation in the first place. It's deeply unhelpful and awful for the families of those children that are having to go on social media themselves and say, please, can you stop doing this?
It's offensive, isn't it?
They should be grieving.
They've got enough to worry about, for goodness sake. The other thing that's being debated right now is whether this has been exacerbated by the fact that we cannot name the suspect. Yeah. Well, we shouldn't be naming the suspect anyway, because no one's been charged with anything yet. And there is a legal precedent which says you do not name a suspect until they've been charged. But the other challenge is that this suspect is 17 years old. Yep. Therefore, they're a youth. Therefore, they're entitled to anonymity. The reason for that is that we have a presumption in this country that people can be rehabilitated, particularly if they've committed crimes as children, that because they are not fully grown, fully fledged adults, we give young people who commit crimes the right to try and rehabilitate and atone and amend and change. Yeah.
And I think there's a debate to be had about whether 18 is too high an age. I feel that people who are, say, 16 are more than capable of knowing what's right and what's wrong, maybe even younger than that. But that's another debate. Again, there's a similarity here with the Huw Edwards case. I think that social media has filled a vacuum, which has been created by the fact that we don't know, or we're not allowed to say very much about this suspect. But I think that there is a middle ground somewhere where, 20 years ago, as you and I know, the police would have spoken to the media. They would have given us a bit of a picture of what was going on here. And then we could have, in agreement with the police, have reported in a sensible way on what was and wasn't true, even if it's just what isn't true.
Yes.
But when there's a vacuum and social media takes over, then we end up with the sort of scenes that we've seen.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, back when we started in journalism, Gordon, we used to work on local papers. You'd go round to the local police station, you'd chat to a copper with your notebook, anything happened, and they'd give you a rundown of the events overnight.
They would hand over the incident book, and I used to go through it and look at all the things that had happened overnight, and I'd say, oh, that's interesting. Can I find out more about that? Yes, you can. And it worked for everybody.
Also, we used to go out on crimes, and you'd be standing by the police tape, and it would be usually being kind of manned by a junior officer and a senior officer, and you'd say, can I speak to the senior officer in charge of this case? And again, with your notebook, you'd literally say directly to the police officer, what's gone on here? What can we report? What can't we? Then two things happened. We had what I would call a kind of corporatization of communications between the police and the press, cutting out that direct one-to-one contact and having press officers come in instead. That then meant, by the way, that all of the quotes you ever got would be sanitized. We used to get great quotes, didn't we, about criminals? You know, he's an absolute scumbag. He deserves to be put behind bars for life. And instead you get this sanitized... Well, you just bring the press office. Well, the press officer go, oh, yes, this incident happened and it was very unfortunate, and it's not quite as colourful as it should be, reporting crime. And then Leveson happened, and the Leveson inquiry exposed this idea of police officers accepting lunches, which were then classed as bribes, and journalists becoming criminalised for having close relations with police officers, some of that legitimate, some of that perhaps overblown. And it's created this breakdown in communications that we know people in the force, in the journalism sphere and in the legal sphere are all trying to repair that damage and make those relationships closer. But it would make for more informed reporting, and it would prioritise the mainstream media and the information that they're party to, and very much separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to just online sleuths talking complete nonsense on social media. One more thing to mention, Gordon, with COVID backlogs and the pressure on the courts, although he's this suspect a youth now, because of COVID backlogs and the pressure on the justice system, there'll probably be a huge delay between an initial preliminary hearing and then the actual case, by which point that suspect may have come of age, and then we will find out who it is.
So we've had a lot of feedback, Camilla, haven't we, on our Liz Truss interview from yesterday. And one thing that seems to be obsessing people a little bit is the journey that she took from McDonald's to the Count, which involved her going over a level crossing.
Yes, so we got this, somebody questioned this, and then we've had people questioning it on social media. You know, there isn't a level crossing there, or it can't be that McDonald's because it doesn't open until 7 a.m. We have gone back into investigative journalism mode.
We sure did.
And we went online and we discovered that the McDonald's that she went to was one open for 24 hours.
Yep.
She then took a journey up a road called Tennyson Avenue, which links the McDonald's to Kings Lynn Leisure Centre, which for the record is called Lynn Sport.
Yep.
And what's in the middle of that road?
A level crossing.
But
are there trains at that time of day?
We tried to investigate that and we realised it could have been a freight train for which there are no timetables for public consumption.
Exactly.
So can we just give Liz Truss the benefit of the doubt that she was delayed to her count by a McDonald's and a level crossing?
I think we can.
And also the feedback, Gordon, doesn't this just sum up feelings about the former Prime Minister? Like Marmite, you either love her or hate her. Richard Woods loves her. Well done for giving Liz Truss the right of reply. In one of the most shameful episodes in recent political history, she was, in effect, toppled by a coup organised, as stated, by the establishment, including the traitorous One Nation group, who wanted the cosy declinism to continue. The only thing she did wrong was to throw Kwasi Kwarteng under a bus when she broke under extreme pressure. But not everyone likes her, Gordon.
No, we had contact from Catherine Maria Vassallo, who said, I think we were all the victims of Liz Truss's inability to gauge at any level how the financial markets were likely to respond to her plans. Credit where it's due. Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak did a very good job of quietly stabilising the situation, and I think posterity will recognise that.
And Paul Hilling, who responded to a TikTok of Liz Truss saying, no, I'm the real victim here. And by the way, I had nothing to do with your mortgage going up because interest rates are set by the Bank of England and Andrew Bailey.
Who she'd like to have sacked.
Who she'd like to have sacked, she said. And Paul Hilling, I think, summed up the mood of some whose mortgages have skyrocketed by saying, can you ask about my mortgage renewal and will she pay the difference? Paul, I'm not sure she will, but thank you for that contribution. Gordon, we'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m.